The summer the wells went dry across the valley. A woman named Dara Voss stood in the shade of the old feed barn at the edge of Clemens Creek, and the crowd that had gathered there did not quite know what to do with its own hands. Men who had laughed at her the previous autumn now turned their hats in slow circles, worrying the brims. Women who had shaken their heads at the sale now stood close together, saying nothing. The auctioneer, whose name was Rutherford, kept clearing his throat as though a word were caught there that he could not bring up and could not swallow. And at the back of the loose assembly, in a pale linen suit that had never quite belonged in that county, stood Harlan Greer, the regional acquisitions officer for the Palmetto Consolidated Land Trust. Holding a clipboard and watching Dara Voss with the expression of a man who has just realized he played the wrong card and cannot reach back across the table to retrieve it. Dara did not speak right away. She stood with her boots in the dust and her hands at her sides, and she looked out over the heads of the assembled community toward the land beyond the barn, which was the only thing green for 40 miles in any direction that counted. The creek still trickled there, the willows still held, and beneath the willows the earth breathed, with a slow generative patience that had nothing to do with any of the people watching her. When she finally did speak, she spoke quietly enough that those at the back had to lean forward, and Harlan Greer had to press closer than he had intended, which was, in its way, a small and perfect justice. But to understand what she said, and why it landed the way it did, and why Rutherford the auctioneer later told his granddaughter it was the finest thing he had witnessed in 40 years of conducting public sales, you have to go back to the previous October. When the leaves had just turned and the auction notice for the 75 acres along Clemens Creek had been tacked to the post office board, and the land itself had been described by 3 separate parties on 3 separate occasions as worthless. The first to use the word was the county assessor, who said it in the comfortable tone of a man stating something everyone already knew. The second was Harlan Greer himself, who said it in the soothing tone of a man who wants you to believe he is doing you a favor by agreeing with you. The third was a farmer named Dolph Kane, who farmed the largest spread of tillage ground west of the creek, and whose opinion on most agricultural matters functioned in that community the way a bell functions in a church. It rang, and people turned toward it. Dolph Kane said the Clemens Creek parcels were willow-choked, perpetually wet, undrainable, without expenditure that would exceed any possible return, and that whoever bought them at auction was throwing their money into mud. He said this at the hardware store counter, in earshot of 11 people and 2 dogs, and the 11 people nodded, and the 2 dogs showed no sign of disagreement. Dara Voss arrived in Mettler County 6 days before the auction. She came in a pickup truck with a gooseneck trailer, and in the trailer were 22 hogs, which is not the number of hogs a sensible person brings to a county where they have no land yet secured, where, unless they are the kind of person who has done their arithmetic very carefully and has decided to bet almost everything on a single reading of a piece of country they have studied on paper for 3 months. She had studied the historical land survey maps at the State Geological Archive. She had read the drainage assessment filed in 1947 and read between its particular lines with the attention of someone looking for what the document was trying not to say. She had noted that the 1947 assessor had described the subsurface of the Clemens Creek bottomland as exhibiting anomalous compaction and mineral staining consistent with previous hydraulic activity at depth, and she had noted further that this phrase appeared once and was not followed up, as though whoever wrote it had thought better of drawing attention to it. Read. She had driven out to the fence line and walked it on foot, alone, in early September, pressing the toe of her boot into the earth in various places, and what she felt beneath the silt and the willow root and the wet black soil was something that had a story in it. She could not have proven this in any courtroom or any conversation at a hardware counter. She knew it the way a person sometimes knows a thing before they can say why, which is not the same as guessing. The auction was held on a cold, bright Tuesday in October. The crowd was smaller than for a conventional farm sale, because the lot had already been prejudged, and Dolph Kane stood near the front with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his expression already set to the satisfaction of a man watching a prediction confirm itself. There were 4 bidders. 2 dropped out in the first 90 seconds. The third, a land speculator from 2 counties east, dropped out when the price reached $60 an acre after deciding there was not enough upside to justify his time. Dara Voss was the 4th. She bid $75 an acre, which is what the auction description had said as the opening floor, and there was no further bid, and the gavel came down, and she owned 75 acres of willow-choked bottomland along Clemens Creek, for a total of $5,625, which was just over half of everything she had in the world at that moment. The laughter was not cruel in the way that requires malice. It was the comfortable laughter of a community that believes. It understands something the newcomer does not. Dolph Kane did not quite laugh, but he smiled in a way that functioned as laughter's quieter cousin. The county assessor, standing near the refreshment table, said something to the woman beside him that Dara could not quite hear, but whose tone required no translation. And Harlan Greer materialized at her elbow within 4 minutes of the gavel stroke, which suggested he had been positioned for exactly that approach, and he said that he represented the Palmetto Consolidated Land Trust, which had significant holdings throughout the region, and that he wanted her to know, before she got too far invested, that his organization had been evaluating those parcels and had determined that the remediation costs alone would run to roughly $40,000, and that he would be willing, out of genuine concern for her situation, to relieve her of the purchase at cost, saving her the inevitable heartbreak of throwing good money after bad. Dara looked at him for a moment. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Greer." And that was all she said, and she walked to her truck. She set the hogs on the land that afternoon. 22 hogs moving through willow breaks and wet bottomland, rooting and turning and churning the earth in the methodical and utterly purposeful way that hogs have been doing since before the species had a name for what it was accomplishing. Dara had chosen the breed with the same careful attention she had brought to everything else: large heritage animals, deep-shouldered and long-snouted, built for exactly this kind of foraging work. In the truck, on the drive down, she had named the patriarch of the group Solomon, because she had needed to name something to anchor the whole venture in something concrete and warm, and Solomon had the unhurried dignity of an animal that did not need anyone's approval. He was the color of creek mud, and he weighed 430 pounds. And when he moved through the willows, he moved like a deliberate thought. The arithmetic of those first weeks was not comfortable. She had paid $5,625 for the land. She had the 22 hogs and a leased backcountry pasture she was sharing, for the short term with a neighbor 2 miles east, who had taken her money for the use of his barn, in exchange for help with his fence repair, a fair trade that left her less cash and more capable. She had enough operating money for approximately 4 months, if nothing went wrong, and something always goes wrong. She made herself write the numbers every night in a small brown ledger she kept beside her sleeping bag in the back of the truck. Not because she enjoyed looking at them, but because a number you have written down cannot surprise you the way an unexamined number can. And she had decided some years earlier that she would rather be frightened by arithmetic she understood than undone by arithmetic she had avoided. The willow breaks were difficult. She spent the first 2 weeks cutting and hauling and stacking, learning where the ground would hold her weight and where it would not, learning the creek's mood in the morning against its mood in the evening, learning that the land had its own ideas about what it was willing to be, and that fighting those ideas consumed twice the energy of working with them. She built a simple shelter from salvaged lumber and galvanized roofing sheet. She ran a fence line along the higher perimeter that took her 4 days and left her hands raw enough that she wrapped them at night with torn strips of an old work shirt. She did not complain about this to anyone because there was no one to complain to, and she had made her peace with that fact before she signed the auction transfer. On the 16th night, sitting in the shelter with her ledger and a kerosene lamp, she heard Solomon moving through the far end of the willow break in the dark, and then she heard him stop. and then she heard nothing, and after a few minutes she heard the other hogs converging on the place where he had stopped, which is not typical nocturnal hog behavior. She pulled her boots on and went out into the dark with a flashlight, and found all 22 animals gathered in a loose circle in the mud at the northeast corner of the lowest lying parcel, which was the area the 1947 assessor had described with that careful, understated phrase she had never quite been able to forget. The ground there had been turned and turned and turned again, and Solomon stood in the center of it, with his snout lifted, and his expression, insofar as hogs have expressions, one of absolute certainty. Beneath the beam of the flashlight, the earth at the center of that churned area was darker than the surrounding soil, and it was damp in a way that was not the damp of a wet season, but the damp of something coming from below. She stood there for a long time. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. The land had been speaking since October, and she had been listening, and now the land had said something specific enough that even she, who was not given to theatrical interpretation, understood it clearly. The neighbor who appeared at her fence 3 days later was a woman named Ileska Varga, who was 74 years old and had come to Metla County from a village in Hungary 41 years earlier with her first husband and a trunk of practical knowledge about the bottomland ecosystems of flood-prone river valleys. Knowledge that her first husband had not possessed and had not thought to acquire, and had therefore farmed himself into difficulty before the end of the first decade. Ileska had saved the operation after his death through the patient application of everything she had been told by her grandmother and her grandmother's mother about the particular way wetland speaks, and she was regarded in the community as somewhat eccentric, somewhat formidable, and largely correct on matters involving soil, though this last quality was acknowledged only in retrospect and never quite to her face. Ileska came to the fence and looked at the land, and at the hogs, and at Dara, and she did not laugh. She said, in her accented English, that moved with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had long since stopped worrying about whether she was understood, that the old people of her village had a saying which she would translate as freely as she could, which was this: "The ground keeps better books than any man, and it will show you the balance when it is ready." She said that the hog knows the balance before the farmer does, because the hog reads the ground with its whole body and does not second-guess what it finds. She said that the willow is not a weed, but a signature, and that wherever the willow grows thick in the low country and will not be persuaded away, there is something below worth being persuaded toward. Then she looked at the northeast corner of the low parcel, at the dark-churned earth and the circle of attentive hogs, and she said, "That is where I would listen most carefully." And she walked back to her own land without waiting for a response which Dara found entirely appropriate. Dara listened. She listened with her boots and her hands, and a length of steel rod she drove into the earth in a grid pattern across the northeast quadrant, mapping the compaction and the resistance and the depth at which the character of the soil changed. She found what she had begun to suspect. She would find at a depth of 11 feet below the northeast corner of the low parcel there was a confined aquifer, pressurized and clean, of the kind that the 1947 assessor had been too cautious or too disinterested to pursue, and which the particular geology of the Clemens Creek watershed had been quietly maintaining for a very long time, beneath the willow roots and the wet black silt and the assessments of people who thought they knew what the land was worth. She did not drill immediately. She did the arithmetic first. A functioning artesian well on that parcel, flowing at even a modest rate, in a county where summer drought was a recurring and worsening reality, was worth considerably more than $75 an acre. She understood this the way you understand a card you are holding and have not yet played. She kept the hogs working. She kept the ledger. She kept her own counsel. A boy named Peter Seff began appearing at the fence in late November. He was 9 years old, and he came after school and on weekends, and he did not ask permission, which Dara found easy to forgive, because he also did not make noise, which was rarer and more valuable. He watched the hogs with the focused attention of a naturalist, and within 2 weeks he had assigned a name to every one of the 22 animals, which Dara discovered not because he told her, but because she heard him speaking to them one afternoon in a low, clear voice, calling each one by a name. And the hogs appeared to listen with the polite attentiveness of animals who have been addressed as individuals rather than as livestock. Solomon he called by his already given name, which Dara took as evidence of sound judgment in a 9-year-old. The largest sow, a broad-backed animal with an ear that folded differently from the others, Peter called Agnes, and Agnes appeared to approve. Peter's family farmed a narrow strip of ground on the dry eastern bench above the valley, ground that had never been generous and that the drought conditions of the past 3 years had made nearly untenable. Peter's father did not come to look at what Dara was doing. Peter came instead and said nothing about his father's situation and helped with small tasks, and one afternoon in December said simply that Solomon knew things in the tone of a person reporting an established fact. Dara said she had noticed. Peter nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose observation has been confirmed by someone qualified to confirm it. In January, a man drove a panel truck with out-of-county plates down the county road and stopped at Dara's fence and called out to ask whether those were heritage hogs on that pasture. He was a butcher and charcutier from the city, a man named Foss, who had been searching the region for heritage animals raised on natural forage because he supplied a restaurant group whose clientele would pay substantially for provenance and flavor that could not be replicated by confinement operations. He asked what she was getting for her animals on the current market. She told him. He said he would pay 60% above that rate for any animals she was willing to sell, provided he could verify the forage and the conditions, which he was prepared to do right now by walking the parcel if she had no objection. She had no objection. He walked the parcel, and he looked at the willows and the churned earth and the hogs moving through it, and he said, without theatricality, that this was extraordinary country for this kind of animal and that he had not seen better in 4 years of looking. She sold him 4 animals that January and 3 in February, and used the premium to pay down her operating deficit and to commission a licensed well driller on a delayed engagement contingent on certain geological confirmations she was still working through, and she told no one any of this. And the town continued to regard her with the comfortable pity of people whose predictions appear to be taking a long time to confirm themselves, but who feel no doubt that confirmation is eventual and certain. Harlan Greer came back in February. He had a different suit, still pale, still wrong for the county. He said that the land trust had revised its assessment of the Clemens Creek parcels and was now prepared to offer her twice what she had paid, which was $150 an acre, a total of $11,250, which he framed as an extraordinary opportunity and a significant profit on a 5-month hold. He said this with the warmth of a man performing warmth rather than feeling it, and his eyes moved, as he spoke, in the direction of the northeast quadrant of the low parcel in a way that was not quite casual enough. He referenced the compaction depth in the northeast corner as roughly 11 feet, which was a number she had never told anyone and which had not appeared in any document she was aware of. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Greer," and that was all she said. She said it to his back, already turning toward his truck. He did not know what she had noticed. That was, she thought, his particular and defining error. The well driller came in March and confirmed what the steel rod and the hog and the 1947 assessor's careful euphemism had all been saying for different reasons in different languages. A confined aquifer at 11 feet, artesian pressure, sufficient to sustain a flow of approximately 90 gallons per minute inute without pumping, clean and cold and continuous, representing a water source of the kind that does not appear in this county more than once in a generation. The driller had been in the business for 31 years, and he told her so with the solemn air of a man delivering information whose significance he wants to make sure has been registered. She capped the well. She kept the hogs working. She kept the ledger. She let the ground keep its books, and she kept hers, and the two sets agreed with each other in a way that made her feel, for the first time since October, something that was not quite happiness, but was the structural foundation on which happiness could eventually be built. May arrived in Medlar County, the way a door opens onto a furnace. The temperature climbed to 103 degrees before the end of the first week, and did not drop again in any meaningful way for 9 weeks after that. The creek dropped. The wells dropped. The stock ponds turned to cracked pale plates of clay, and the livestock that had been carried through the winter, on the assumption that summer would relent as it usually relented, were suddenly in serious trouble. Dolph Kane's main well failed in the second week of June. 2 other operations lost stock in the third week. By the beginning of July, the county had filed an agricultural emergency declaration, and Harlan Greer's Palmetto Consolidated Land Trust had dispatched 3 additional representatives to the county with offers for distressed land acquisitions because the land trust had grasped, with the fast instinct of institutional greed, that a water crisis in a dry county is also a purchasing opportunity for anyone who has the liquidity to wait while others suffer. Dara's land did not dry. The Willows held their color. The Hogs continued to move through the bottomland with their customary purposeful indifference to crisis. The uncapped well, which she had now brought into quiet operation behind a fence line that limited visibility from the road, produced its 90 gallons per minute the way it had been producing it for geological ages without needing anyone's opinion on the matter. Harlan Greer appeared at her gate in the second week of July with 2 men behind him and a document in his hand and a tone that had abandoned the performance of warmth entirely in favor of something closer to administrative certainty. He said that the land trust had filed a petition with the county water authority asserting prior appropriation rights to the subsurface aquifer underlying the Clemens Creek bottomland parcels on the grounds that the relevant geological formation extended beneath trust-owned land upstream, and that his organization therefore held a superior claim to the BTAD resource. He said this was not personal, which is what people say when a thing is entirely personal. With that, he said she would be hearing from the county water board within the week, and that in the meantime, his earlier offer of $11,250 remained on the table as a goodwill gesture, and that she might want to consider it seriously. He said the words prior appropriation with the confidence of a man who has used legal language successfully against people who did not have the resources to fight it, which was not an unreasonable assessment in most cases, but was in this one. She had used 3 months of early premium revenue to retain a water rights attorney from the state capitol on a contingency arrangement, because she had understood from the evening in February when Harlan Greer's eyes moved toward the northeast quadrant, and he cited an 11-foot depth that had never been in any public document that she was going to need. 1. She said, "Tell the water board I look forward to the conversation." And she said it with the same quietness she brought to everything. And Harlan Greer left, and she went back to the Hogs. Dolph Kane came to her gate in the third week of July. He was a large man, accustomed to the kind of physical confidence that comes from being, in most observable situations, the largest person and the most established farmer in a given county. And he stood at her gate with neither of those things available to him, and it showed in his hands, which were working the top rail of the gate with the same slow circling grip that the whole community had brought to its hat brims on the morning she would remember coming. He said that his well had been dry for 6 weeks, and his cattle needed water, and he was losing ground fast, and he understood she might have something he needed, and he had come to ask for it directly. He said he knew he had not been generous in his opinions about her operation. He said that in a straightforward way, without performance, which cost him something, and which she could see it costing him, and she gave him credit for it. She said, "How many head?" He said, 83. She said, "I can run a line from the south side of the northeast parcel to the fence at your property line. I'll charge you for the pipe and the labor, not for the water." But Dolph Kane looked at her for a moment. He said, "That is more than fair." She said, "I know it is." Then she said, "And I'll need you at the county water board meeting on the 14th, and I'll need you to say in public what you just told me here." And he said he would, and she believed him. Because a man who will walk to the gate of someone he has mocked and speak plainly without excuse is the kind of man who will also speak plainly in a public room when he has promised to. Ileska Varga appeared at the fence the morning before the water board meeting, as she had appeared at intervals throughout the spring and summer, each time with a brief observation and no requirement of response. She said that her grandmother had another saying, which she had not yet shared, which was this: "Water does not argue about where it belongs. It goes where it is needed, and it remembers every place it has been." She said she thought Dara might find that useful tomorrow. Dara said she thought she might. Peter Seth came that same afternoon, the first time he had come on a weekday during school hours, which meant he had walked 4 miles on his own initiative, and he stood by the fence and looked at the hogs, and then looked at Dara, and said that his father had asked whether there was any work on the place that needed doing, and Dara said there was always work. She said to tell his father to come on Saturday. Peter nodded and looked satisfied, and then said, "Agnes had 3 piglets this morning, and Dara said she knew, and he said, I named them already, and she said I would expect nothing else." The water board met on a Thursday afternoon in the county civic building, which was a low-ceilinged room with a ceiling fan that distributed the heat without reducing it. There were 41 people present, which was the largest attendance at a water board meeting in county memory. And Holland Greer sat at the front with his 2 men and his documents and a water rights attorney of his own, whose suit was considerably more expensive than Greer's, and who had driven 4 hours from the city to be there. The board chair was a woman named Prescott, who had been managing water allocations in this county for 19 years, and who was in the habit of conducting meetings as though each minute of public time had a dollar value she had pledged to honor. Harlan Greer's attorney made his prior appropriation argument in 11 minutes, with the smooth efficiency of someone who has made the same argument before different boards in different counties and has won it more than half the time. He referenced geological surveys. He cited the upstream trust holdings. He argued that the aquifer was a shared resource and that its management should be consolidated under a single administrative entity, by which he meant the land trust, in exchange for access fees that his written proposal set at a rate that the community would have found, if anyone had done the arithmetic in the room at that moment, to be approximately 4 times the market rate for municipal water supply. He was polite and thorough, and he had clearly done this before. Dara's attorney spoke for 7 minutes and introduced 4 documents. The first was the original land deed, predating the trust's upstream acquisitions by 62 years, establishing that the aquifer surface expression fell entirely within the Clemens Creek bottomland parcel. The second was a geological opinion from a licensed hydrologist, confirming that the aquifer was a closed system with no demonstrated hydraulic connection to the upstream parcels. The third was the 1947 assessor's report, with the anomalous compaction and mineral staining language highlighted, establishing prior documented evidence of the aquifer's existence within the parcel boundary. The fourth was a communication from the trust's own internal assessment, obtained through a public records request, in which an unnamed trust representative had noted the subsurface resource at 11 feet depth in the northeast quadrant of the Clemens Creek parcel as of February of the current year, a date at which Dara Voss had held clear title and at which she had shared that specific depth measurement with no one, which demonstrated that the trust had been conducting unauthorized subsurface assessment of private land without the owner's knowledge or consent. The room was quiet when the fourth document was read aloud. The quiet had a particular quality, the quality of a community, recognizing something it should perhaps have seen earlier, seeing it now, and deciding how to situate itself in relation to what it sees. Harlan Greer's attorney leaned toward his client, and they conferred in a low voice for approximately 30 seconds, and then the attorney said that his client reserved the right to respond to the characterization of the fourth document in a subsequent filing, which is the language a lawyer uses when the situation has shifted and he is repositioning toward an exit. Board Chair Prescott asked Dara Voss whether she had anything she wished to say to the board directly. Dara stood. She said that the aquifer on her land was producing 90 gallons per minute continuously, which at current consumption rates was sufficient to supply stock water to every operation in the valley for the duration of the drought and for any reasonable drought that followed it. She said that she had no interest in selling the water or the land. She said that she had already run a line to Dolph Kane's property at cost, and that she was prepared to do the same for any other operation in the county that needed it, at cost of materials and labor, and that she was not charging for the water because the water did not belong to her in the way a piece of equipment or a length of fence belongs to you. She said it belonged to the land, and she was the land's steward, and a steward's job is not to sell what they hold in trust, but to see that it reaches the people who need it. She said this last part simply, without drama, and then she sat down. The ceiling fan turned. 41 people breathed in a low-ceilinged room in the middle of a drought that had lasted 9 weeks and showed no immediate intention of relenting. Dolph Kane stood up. He was still a large man, and he was still accustomed to being the most established farmer in most rooms he entered, and he used both of those things now in service of a function they had not previously served, which was to say plainly, front of 40 people, that he had laughed at this woman's purchase, that he had been publicly wrong, and that she had offered him water for his cattle without condition when he came to her gate with nothing to offer in return, and that the community owed her not only its gratitude, but its support in the matter before the board, and that anyone who wanted to discuss the prior appropriation argument was welcome to discuss it with him first. He said the last part with a simplicity that left no ambiguity about what discussing it with him would involve. 3 other farmers stood in sequence and said similar things in shorter versions. The Seth family was not in the room because Peter's father had come to the land on Saturday and worked without conversation and accepted no wages, which Dara had understood as its own kind of statement. But their absence was noted, and its cause was known, and it spoke without requiring a chair. Harlan Greer stood and said that the Land Trust was withdrawing its petition pending further review of the geological documentation, and that he wanted to express his organization's continued interest in partnership with the local agricultural community. He said this in the tone of a man who has decided that the word partnership can do the work of retreat without requiring the admission of retreat. No one in the room appeared to be deceived by this, but no one pursued him, because there was nothing left to pursue. He collected his documents and walked to the door and through it, and the 2 men in their wrong county suits followed him, and the door closed behind them with the finality of a chapter ending. The rains came 3 weeks later, which is a thing the rains do not do on anyone's schedule or because the story requires them, but which happened to align, as things sometimes align in lives lived patiently and in close attention to the land, with the moment when the need was greatest and the valley's resilience was thinnest. The creek rose, the stock ponds filled, the willows on the bottomland, which had been the signature of everything, deepened their green to the color of something satisfied. Dara spent the morning of the first rain day standing in it, not taking shelter, letting it come down on her hat and her shoulders and the backs of her hands, feeling the land change under her boots as the surface began to receive what it had been waiting for. Solomon stood nearby with his snout tipped upward and his eyes partially closed in an expression that she had learned to read as the Hog version of deep approval. Agnes was in the far shelter with her 3 piglets, all of whom were now named and all of whom were in Peter's assessment showing distinct personality traits that warranted monitoring. Ileska came to the fence that afternoon and stood in the rain without apparent inconvenience and looked at the land and said nothing for a long while. And then she said that her grandmother had been right about the ground keeping better books than any man, and that it was always gratifying when the accounts balanced. Dara said she was grateful for the saying. Ileska said, "You listened before I told you." The saying only confirmed what you already knew how to do. She said it in the plain-spoken way. She said everything, and then she stood at the fence for a while longer, in companionable silence, which is the truest form of acceptance a community can offer a newcomer, which is to simply be present without requiring explanation or performance from the person whose presence you are accepting. Peter came after school and stood in the light rain with his hands in his pockets and watched Solomon for a long time. Then he said, "Solomon knew about the water all along." Dara said, "I believe he did." Peter said, "Do you think he knew about all of it?" And he waved his hand at the general situation, meaning the drought, and the meeting, and Harlan Greer, and Dolph Kane, and the ceiling fan in the Civic Building, and the fourth document, and all of it. And Dara considered this seriously. The rest of it was our business to sort out. Peter nodded, as though this were a satisfying and responsible division of labor, which Dara thought it was. The ledger at the end of that year showed a number she had not expected to see for 3 years, which was the number that meant she was not merely surviving, but beginning, in the careful and unshowy way of someone who does not trust comfort that arrives ahead of the work that earns it to build. She had 31 hogs now. She had the well producing its 90 gallons per minute in organized flow to 7 neighboring operations under a cooperative agreement drafted by a lawyer she had retained with premium revenue and signed by 9 farmers, including Dolph Kane, who signed it first and with a particular firmness of pen that suggested he wanted it known he had signed it first. She had a water right that was now registered and defended and belonged, in the legal language that had been established through the water board process, to the parcel and its steward in perpetuity. She had the barn repaired and the fence lines straight and a small room inside the barn with a real bed and a window that faced east over the willow brake, which at dawn in the early fall produced a light that did not require any interpretation to appreciate. She was not, in the language of the county, a newcomer any longer. She was not exactly what anyone had expected her to become, either because no one had expected anything of her at all, and she had thought about that in the way you think about things while doing repetitive physical work that leaves the mind available for reflection, and she had decided that being underestimated is only a handicap if you allow the estimator's number to become your own. Her number had always been different from theirs. The land had agreed with her number from the beginning. It had simply taken the rest of the valley, a drought and a public meeting and a ceiling fan and 4 documents, to arrive at the same conclusion. Solomon moved through the willows in the October dusk with the unhurried authority of an animal that has never doubted its own purpose and has no reason to begin doing so now. The willows were starting to yellow at the tips, which is what they do in October when the season turns, which is not the same as failing. The ground kept its books. The water moved where it was needed. The balance, as Ieliska's grandmother had known it would, had come clear in its own time, in the only language the land speaks, which is patience, and the willingness to be present in the same place long enough to hear what it is saying. Dara Voss stood at the fence line in the last light and listened, and the land, as it always had, was talking.